Hey, everybody. So let's talk about families today. So, the first thing I want to talk to you about when we talk about families is something called the structural diversity model. So, there's two parts to this. The first part is that it says that the family form is socially constructed and constantly changing. So, remember when we talked about race and gender, we talked about how both are social constructions, meaning that society has decided what those things are, or what those things mean, or how they look. The same thing with the family. As a society, as a culture, we have decided what a family is and what makes up a family. And the way that we have thought of family has changed a lot over the last, even let's say 40 years or 50 years. Think about the way your parents thought about family, your grandparents thought about family, and the idea of what makes up a traditional family. The traditional family is socially constructed. So, as a culture, we have decided what we define a family as. So, maybe for some of you, that's your siblings, it's your aunts and uncles and cousins, your grandparents, extended family. Maybe for some of you, you have friends who you would think of more as your family than your actual family. Maybe we're talking about pets. But the idea of what makes up a family, according to the structural diversity model, is constantly changing. Even if we just think in the last 30 years and where we have gone from not accepting same-sex partners as families all the way to the legalization of marriage for same-sex families. So this is what the structural diversity model is getting at, that we are constantly changing how we view a family. It also says that in order for us to understand a family, we have to challenge what we call a monolithic view of a family, meaning we have to challenge this idea that there is just one way to be a family. When, of course, as I've just listed, there are tons of ways, right? You've got single parents, you've got step parents, you've got blended families, you've got same-sex families, you've got the traditional mom, dad, 2.5 kids, which is such a dumb statistic, the dog, the fence, all of that, right? There's lots of ways that we can make up a family, and sociology is interested in all of them. So the way we connect this with theory is structural functionalist theory says that the family is necessary because it keeps society running smoothly, that the family is the thing that drives us as a society. It says that families provide support and stability. So functionalist theory is getting at the idea that our family is what sort of teaches us the acceptable and unacceptable ways of being out in the world. It also is where we get our support, where we get our comfort, all of that. Now, I will say there is a bit of a problem with the functionalist theory approach. And some of you may have already thought of this, right? Are all families functional? No, right? Some are really incredibly dysfunctional. I mean, all the way from really minimal, just sort of conflict, all the way to abuse and neglect and all of the awful things that happened in families. So one way we can critique this theory, because remember, theories aren't perfect, they can be critiqued, is to say, you know what, hey, not every family is functional. Not every family provides support and stability. Also, with Marx and conflict theory, Marx is going to say that the family structure supports capitalism and it passes on ideas that justify inequality, meaning that your family is probably the first time you figure out capitalism. Like maybe your parents made a deal with you that if you did so many chores, you would get money, or you'd get a toy you really liked, or you'd get something that was really exciting for you. That is what Marx was getting at, that the family structure is your first sort of idea of capitalism. Now, if any of you have watched TV between the hours of like 8 and 3, you will notice that the commercials, especially live TV, not streaming TV, the commercials for that time of day is very much centered on family life and very much centered on selling products, right? Capitalism. So like cleaning products and ads for cars and ads for children's toys, those types of things are really permeate at that point. If you watch any sort of YouTube videos that are sort of aimed at children, right? Like the Lion King, the Pride, you'll notice that commercials leading in or coming out are almost always aimed at toys or some sort of child object, right? This is your sort of first foray into capitalism, and that Marx is saying that the family structure supports that. We learn what we need to buy in order to exist as a family. It also might be the first time you figure out that people aren't equal. Family structures tend to be a really good place where parents will say things like, you can't go to that person's house because they are X, Y, and Z, and we don't associate with them, or we don't want you to play with them because they're not the type of kid we want you to play with, or we don't like their family because their family is insert something unequal there. This is what Marx is getting at. This may be the first time you've figured out inequality based on your family. Okay, ignore this number 3 point. Don't worry about it. Okay, so one of the things I want you to be aware of with family is that all of the social factors that I mentioned in the first lecture, the What is Sociology lecture, those can sort of apply to the family in like kind of a big blob, but there are specific social factors that shape the way children experience life and how families impact children's development. So the first is the family size. So how big your family is, right? How many people are in it? How much space you have, where you sit in that structure we'll get to in a second. But your family size really does impact your experience, especially if you come from a really, really big family or a really, really small family in those extremes. Your birth order, believe it or not, really does shape how you're going to experience life and how you're going to develop as a kid. So, for example, if you are a firstborn, I would venture a guess that your parents were a little bit more strict with you than maybe they were with your younger siblings, or maybe they held you to a standard that was a little bit higher, or maybe just a little bit more unfair than what you saw happening with your younger siblings. If you're in the middle, I'm willing to guess that a lot of your time and energy is spent trying to maintain just sort of a calm with your family. So like maybe you're the problem solver. Maybe you're the one that says, don't worry, I'll just do it. I'll just take care of it. It's not a big deal. If you're the last child, I'm wondering if maybe perhaps your parents sort of said, you know what, if you're the youngest child, your parents maybe said, you know what, perhaps we won't be as strict with you as we were with everyone else. Maybe they said, you know what, just raise yourself at this point. But there's this sort of a little bit less of a hands-on approach with younger kids. With only children, and I'm an only child, the stereotype is that we're all spoiled. We are not. But I'm very good at being alone, and that's sort of something we see with older children, or with only children, sorry. The presence or absence of parents, whether or not your parents were around, is going to impact you, right? And around meaning quality time as opposed to quantity time, because your parents could spend tons of time with you, but you're never actually like connecting with them. Or your parents could be physically like present in the house, but everybody's off in their own room on their own devices, doing their own thing and not actually connecting. So the presence or absence of parents is a big one. Your socioeconomic status. So not just how much money your family has when you're growing up, but what their status is. So the amount of education they have, what kind of job they do, those types of things all tie into socioeconomic status. And then also just the fact that you have come into the world affected your parents in some way. And if any of you have kids, you can probably relate to this, that having a child coming into the world totally changes everything, right? So if you haven't, ask your parents at some time, hey, how did having me change things for you? And see what they say. Okay, babies having babies. So this isn't what you think it's going to be, although I do like that phrase. I think it's funny. With babies having babies, I'm talking about being what's called a pronatalist culture. So pronatalism is a culture that encourages people to have kids, a culture that encourages childbearing. And I'd like to ask when we're face to face, are we a pronatalist culture? Are we a culture that encourages people to have children? And for a lot of instances, we are. Like the United States in general wants people to have babies. We don't actively create laws that tell people not to have children. We don't restrict how many people can, or how many children you can have per family. We don't prefer one sex over the other. In general, we want people to have kids. So with pronatalism, one of the things I want you to think about, or one way to think about this, is how does this get complicated? And one of the ways it gets complicated is stuff like teen pregnancy, or sex before marriage, or even sex education, right? The way that people are taught about what sex is. How does that tie into this culture that also does encourage us to have kids? But what happens when it starts to get muddy? So you're going to have a link underneath this video to a piece of a short video from the can't get the words out. Can't A short video from the television show Last Week Tonight, and it's going to talk about sex education. So you don't have to pause me. You can watch this after I'm done. But I do want to give the caveat that it does talk about sex, and it talks about sex graphically. So if that's uncomfortable for you, I just sort of want to give you the heads up beforehand so you know you can avert your eyes or mute it or whatever. Just read the captions. But it's going to talk about sex. It's also going to talk about sex in a comical way, so I hope it does make you laugh at least a little bit. When we're talking about parenting and child development and how this all affects kids, you have a couple different parenting styles. The first is the authoritative parent. This is the parent that is probably the ideal. It's the type of parenting that has a lot of demands and expects a lot from their kids, but also is really warm and receptive. So like, you know, if you fail a test, they're going to go through with you why you failed it, but they're also going to hug you and like maybe give you a cookie and say it'll be okay. That's the authoritative parent. A permissive parent is the whatever you want to do, go for it. Have at it, go crazy, raise yourself. I'll be over here if you need anything. Just let me know let me know, check in every once in a while, make sure I know you're alive. That's the permissive parent. Very few controls or demands on a kid. And then an authoritarian parent. Authoritarian parents are parenting styles that are kind of the opposite of the permissive, where there's constant attention, constantly wanting to know what you're doing, not very warm or receptive. You're not going to get that hug and a cookie if you fail a test, right? That's the authoritarian parent. Okay, so that's all I have to say about families for now. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Bye.